Si hei Maori ora ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama. Whakarongo rā te taringa ki te hautau wā e hau mai. Kei te uru, kei te tai. Huri hea ki muri ki tō tuara. Tiki nā tua kutanga takai waho kei te moana nui ākiwa e takoto mai nei. He koronga nō ku kia tai atu au ki ngā uru kahika, ki ōhui ki ōama. Kia katanua mai ko te ki he tātara. Ko ti pai pai ko hure hure, te ki hi pou namu e tangi ana mo ōnā ke whenua kua tipuria nei te mō heu heu. Tangi kau ana te mapue, tangi kau ana te mapue. Tuatahi, kia koutou, ngā rangatira, ngā ariki. Koutou e pupuri nei i te Maori o te ao pāpāho, te tangata whenua, o te ao putanoa, te ao taketake, nau mai haere mai haere mai. Nau mai whakatau mai ki tēnei wānanga o te wānanga aronui o Tāmaki Makaurau. Nau mai me ngā mate, ngā tapu, ngā ihi, kei runga i a koutou. Nau mai kia tūtakitaki rātau, i a rātau, te hunga wairua ki a rātau. Mauria mai ngā mate kei runga i a koutou, e ka pohi ake nei e te ringa kaha o te korona, o te mate uruta, te korona, iwa te kau mā iwa. Nau mai, me ngā whakamataku ngā tapu ngā ihi kei runga i a koutou. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou e hare ake nei ki tēnei o ngā wānanga, te wānanga o te hono, kei mua i a tātou. Te wawata ia kei te noho ora mai koutou, kei te hau ora mai, kei te hau maru, hoki i roto i tēnei mate uruta. Kei te mihi katoa ki ngā kai kōrero i tēnei rangi, o te ao taketake, koutou e pupuri nei te Maori, o te mātauranga. Nō reira, kā rea tōroa hia te kōrero engari ki a koe mā kos, tēnei hoki te mihi ki a koe, me te rōpū whakahaere i tā tātou wānanga i tēnei ata. Tēnei te mihi, nō reira, puta noi tō tātou wānanga. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa kahuri.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here. 4 years have passed since I was then in Auckland. I remember Marcus and Tatiana and my good friend Diana Albarran, who's in the public, and also Ricardo. And I was in your office, Robert. You explained me all about Maui and the whakapapa traditions from your people. Then I'm going to proceed with our plan, our conversational plan. Then I am going to talk about the plan our South Trajectories seats. Then, hello, thinking a lot about the spontaneity and the emergency as we spoke while preparing this meeting with Fiona and Marcus. It took me a while to think exactly what those seeds could be that would germinate on the fly in our today conversation. I think that we remember that this is a big introduction of ourselves, our places, our peoples, our cities, our countries. And in order to try to have a fluent dialogue as much as possible with short terms speaking, and perhaps question about one's journey from Natalie as a complicator, facilitator, and Marcus too, and everybody in the chat, not necessarily directed at one person, but about what the three of us with Leslie and Frederick, and even with Natalie, can build in general. How today we are not going to use slides or presentations. We are going to flow completely in orality. In this sense, I want to quickly return to the name of this event, link, to link the trajectories or concrete past, futures, our walking the world, the universe, the universities of the South, and even to question the idea of, or the several ideas about the South, which has been what led us to link ourselves, to articulate, to intermingle in forms, undulating forms like the waves of the sea. In my case, I was in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2017, seeking to get closer to the Polynesian and Melanesian cultures of the Pacific, Maori, Samoan, Tongan. I interrupt this moment to pay homage to my mentor there, the professor Albert Refiti, and I also remember Welby Ings and Johnson Bitehira. But I was interested in Maori, Samoan, Tongan talks, and tried to study something more closely, their designs, quotes, which led to consolidate my proposition that in its origins among the peoples called original, aboriginal, natives, First Nation, indigenous people with a root generalization, since each one has its being and his distinctive doing. Rather than design, there are other practices that the forced translation into the Western code make us take for such. Approach that my good friend Frederick questions or calls into question, not because of its theoretical scope, but because the theory that I has been building in these 4 years and even more. Frederick asked about its special value, not for the academic, because it perhaps has, but perhaps of the little use potential for social struggles or for the people. Then I try to propose the colonial doing, the colonial making, rather than a formal research methodology, a kind of ambiguous methodologies. My conceptions or experience of the South, another matter of conversation, is based on the Andean, the Quechua, the Aymara, the Inga, the Muisca, according to the people of the South American mountain range where I live. My academic career before coming to design goes through zootechnics in Colombia, animal production studies, teaching education, and my master's degree was in gender studies. I am not sure exactly when I began to interact with Leslie and Noel, but indeed it was several years ago. Today I was remembering, Leslie, that I perhaps write you an email in inviting you to Colombia. That finally didn't happen. Then your professor came here, but it was several years ago because I was also interested in relation with the Afro-Caribbean perspective on design, the Black experience on design, and the search for a dialogue with the English world that didn't necessarily go to the United States. For instance, talk with people, with English-speaking people of the Caribbean, of Trinidad, as Leslie is important. Together with Leslie and with Frederick, we have also spent a good time talking about my ideas of Southern designs of the South, other designs with other name, which in my thesis I abbreviated as Dessobons with an ugly acronym, try to avoid the word design, or in English, Dessobons, as equivalent of design, similar but different, taking as if they were design, but perhaps practices that have another word to name, to invoke them inside the people that practice them. That means that they are similar but different to what we assume designs are. For Frederick, the idea of designing for liberation, and of preventing design from contributing to oppressing seems very important to me. That idea of Frederick is very important to me. And the three of us, and even with Natalie, coincided within the Future of Education initiative, the invitation of Leslie to that group, that is in a subgroup whose name is under discussion right now, about pluriversal design or designs for the pluriverse. Because as I am good, Don Norman invite Leslie to guide that group. I am a man of the mountain, as my good friend Marcus remembered. I live in Bogotá, in the savannah, 2,600 meters high, and I am happy to build bridges between design, archaeology, and anthropology, all of which I associate with the purpose of Link 2021, that is to increase awareness about practice-oriented approach in art and design, and to stimulate practitioners and educators to share their approaches and methodologies. Coming to the idea of pluriverse, that is another linking idea between us, I am worried, being a student of Arturo Escobar, about his transformation into something trendy, fashionable, that again suppose the multiplication of Western idea of the whole universe on the ideas of everything, of the whole, that all other human groups have. You know, for me, universe is the Western concept to name everything, but it's not necessarily the Lakota or the Wayu or the Muisca or the Maori concept. Just these others are enforced into the become their own wholes encoded as universe. The dominant code reserves the right to compare in their own categories. In fact, the dominant code invented the idea of categories, the wholes, the all of all the others. In that sense, I love the trickster figure, such as the coyote, that jumps between reality, so to speak. And I propose the idea of disignorance, the valuation of the respectful approach to what the design ignores. And I find them extremely pleasant to give an account and recognize partial knowledge, and accept that one cannot fully understand the other in their own terms. And those are my seeds for tomorrow. Then I leave you with my friends to add theirs. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much for inviting me. Muchas gracias. Que ahora, I'm learning. And boa noite para brasileiros, brasileiras. This conversation is a long conversation. It has started since our ancestors met before, right? And different parts of the world, people with different cultures, they had exchanges, but not all of these exchanges, they were just, or they were enriching, mutually enriching. Many times, intercultural exchanges, they were detrimental to the people that were different from what is known. I mean, if you were on the side of the West, if you were a white, male, European, North-Atlantic person, perhaps you would always get benefits from these exchanges. It will be somehow most benefit from these exchanges, and globalizing the world and colonizing and connecting all of them would always benefit a few people instead of benefiting the other ones who are also engaged and also interested on these exchanges. And I guess what we are doing right now is trying to repair, reconstruct, dismantle those past exchanges and those structures that those past exchanges relied upon. And design has been a hallmark of colonization, imperialism, and those exploitative exchanges in the past, in various shapes. through products manufactured with the materials that were extracted from the colonies and sold back to the same colonies for a higher price. And if we extend to these days, we face now digital colonialism through all these digital platforms, including the ones we are using right now. Zoom is an imperialist platform that somehow get all our data and does not really pay us back something for that. So we are still having some unequal exchanges right now, and therefore the discussion about colonialism, or how other authors would prefer coloniality, is pretty much contemporary, right? But what's the role of design into that, and what can we do in this arena of design research and design education, design practice, design activism? Well, currently there is this concept of pluriverse that Alfredo already introduced, and I'm now having a good company of Leslie Ann Noel. She's also developing further this concept, and especially on developing specific approaches for practical approaches for doing design based on the pluriversal design approach. What does it mean, and what does it entail? What are the consequences? And especially the most important question, who get the most benefits from these exchanges? Can the pluriverse be beneficial to those who were disenfranchised in past exchanges? Will be people that have grown up in former colonies or have faced any other kinds of oppression related to these equal exchanges? Will they be able to develop further and to the same level, or at least in a different direction than the people who typically spread those concepts throughout the world? Well, the concept of the pluriverse is spreading through the same channels the other concepts that justified unequal exchanges in the past. And for example, Zoom is being used for multinational companies to spread some concepts that are very detrimental to the nature, to our relationship to Mother Earth and other entities and beings that are completely ignored in a capitalist-centric view of the world. And the pluriverse is also being sold in the shape of books. And now we also have courses, workshops, consultancies, and projects. So there is a risk for sure that this concept begins to become, to be emptied out of strength, and especially revolutionary potential. Arturo Escobar, the person who is responsible for inspiring a lot of people, including Alfredo, Leslie Ann, and many others, I'm sure you heard about him, has written this marvelous book on designs for the pluriverse. And he refers back to the Zapatista motto of the world that can fit many worlds, mundo que se quepan vários mundos. So originally, the pluriverse hadn't such definition. The concept was not defined by the Zapatistas. That's a part of the history that's sometimes forgotten, because the pluriverse comes from a tradition specific to the United States. It's American pragmatism. Beginning of the 20th century, it was stated by William James, and it's part of this discussion of North American plural societies that are based on cultural differences that stay apart from each other. And it also has been misused in so many different ways to justify the existence of ghettos in cities, for example, or to justify what we have experienced in Brazil very heavily, which is whitening of the Black population, whitening of the indigenous population, the erasure of the indigenous ancestrality, for example, in my family, that happened. And this whitening, it also is justified by concepts such as plurality, because they would say, if we all intermingle together, if you all become hybrids, if you all become mestizos, like we call him here in Latin America, there won't be any difference any longer. And that's my concern about this concept of the pluriverse, because since it's a new concept, it has enabled a lot of intercultural dialogues, which are much better than having none. I would prefer that different cultures, different people, different nations, different whatever, they interact. However, we must be careful, again, who gets the most benefit out of it. If we push forward this concept of pluriverse as if it was another name for the melting pot, this concept of trying to put all cultures together in the same cauldron and mix them together so we live in a peaceful coexistence, the multiculturalist society, where those differences are somehow not generate conflicts, then we may end up on benefiting of those who created the cauldrons, those who lighten up the fire, and those who are going to eat the soup because they will profit from it. Because there will be products, there will be services, and there will be designs for the pluriverse that will get a lot of profits from that. And those will for sure not be designs by the social movements, by the people who live in the South, who grew in the South, who have faced oppression. Those will be the designs of the colonizer, the former colonizers who now are trying to somehow hide behind such a welcoming, democratic, diversity, equity, and innovation approach that will definitely somehow, again, destroy, or at least something that can be even worse than destroy, which is co-opting the social movement's fight for truly enriching intercultural dialogues where people are willing to transform themselves through the exchange and not just keeping thinking, understanding, living, embodying the same as they were before. So I hope that I will be able to transform myself together with you, this incredible, marvelous meeting so many different people. And I hope we won't be the same after that conversation. So now I would pass to Leslie, because I'm really curious to what she can bring to the table.
Thank you, Fred. I'm also wondering what I bring to the table. So, you know, I've been thinking about this for a little while. I have a letter that I've written, and then I have some other notes that I've written. So you'll get a little bit of on script and off script as I talk. But Alfredo gave us a prompt that made me think about, okay, our connections, and even how am I in this conversation about the pluriverse. So, you know, my entry into the pluriverse is actually pretty recent. If the pluriverse is a place, right? I came to this party kind of recently, but maybe the party that I came to recently is that party of the pluriverse that people talk about. And it's not that I'm in this discussion recently, right? Maybe it's a little bit accidental, right? Maybe even a little bit naive, because I'm an action researcher, I'm a practitioner. I've become a theorist. I don't even know if to say I'm a theorist, if I've become a theorist, but I've had to engage with theory more and more and more. But my design practice was always about practice, you know, practical. And so I guess you could say part of my motivation of my interest in this pluriversal work is how do we put this into practice, right? So I'll get there to the how we do this and how we get this into practice. But so my interest in this work is motivated by my own agendas, my own imposter syndrome, my own anxieties, my interest in culturally relevant pedagogies, empowering education, critical pedagogy, etc. And I try to be transparent about this when people ask me to talk about the pluriverse, right? But maybe to go step back a little bit, who am I? I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I spent all of my childhood and adolescence in Trinidad. And then one day kind of surprised my parents and decided to go to Brazil, where I spent 6 years in the 90s, actually in the town, I believe, where Fred is now. I say I believe, I know where Fred is supposed to be. So I studied in Curitiba, where I believe Fred is, right? I went back to the Caribbean after I left Brazil. I became a member faculty at the University of the West Indies. And Alfredo, what you said, actually, yes, just rang a bell. We were communicating way back then when I was a faculty member at the University of the West Indies. And I think you probably did invite me to come to Colombia or something like that. But we started our conversation then when I was in Trinidad. I also have spent some time in East Africa, and I've spent many years just traveling and trying to learn from other people and their ways of life. And my interest in people, I will say quite frankly, has always been in people from the global South, people like me, people from, you know, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa. I've never had a lot of contact with people from New Zealand and Australia, but I've also always been interested in the lives of people who do not live in Europe and North America. Because, you know, when you come from a place like the Caribbean, everything that you experience is kind of filtered through Europe and North America. You know, TV comes from America, or, you know, and so all of this work has been interesting, I've always been interested in, okay, how do other people live in these other places? You know, are they affected by these filters or not? How do we learn from these people? And yeah, and let me go back on script a little bit, right? So some of my work, even in Trinidad, some of my work has been about justifying my existence as a designer. Because in Trinidad, I was expected to be an artist, you know, and in Trinidad has a pretty strong design culture, but then there are always these questions about who gets to do design, what is design, is this art, is this craft, you know, and then there's a little bit of self-consciousness about our design practice in Trinidad, because as well of this filter, you know, if people have studied in Pratt or Parsons or one of these US schools and they come back to Trinidad, they then become very self-conscious about our own design practice, right? Because I was an academic, even in Trinidad, when I went to US and UK conferences, I found that most researchers were focusing on questions that did not interest me at all. You know, I remember one conference in particular, I was just walking from room to room to room, and I couldn't understand what people were talking about, right? And then maybe I would meet someone from India and I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, we're speaking the same language. We are interested in the same questions. Or I would, like, there's one designer from Nigeria who I met maybe 10 years ago in a conference. And again, it was the same thing, that we just found that we were interested in the same kinds of questions around people, around production in different ways. And so I started to think that, okay, designers in the global North and designers in the global South were speaking two completely different languages. And so at the Design Research Society conference in 2018, Arturo Escobar was one of the keynote speakers. And in his keynote, he articulated so clearly what I had been thinking. And I mean, not what I guess is obvious to all of us from the global South, you know, and he actually had a slide up where he showed the kinds of questions that designers in the global North were dealing with, and then the questions that designers in the global South were dealing with. And I don't remember his source data. He might have been looking at previous DRS conferences and analyzing who had been talking about what. But I was already interested in emancipatory research and action research at that time. And my colleague, Renata Marx Leitão, and I we already had planned to come up with a special interest group that would only focus on people in the global South. But when we both heard Arturo's speech, we said, okay, that's the name, actually. It is the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group that we want to create. And so, you know, we, after the conference, you know, we did a whole lot of writing and whatnot. And we had actually some other names in the background before we chose that one. But really listening to Arturo Escobar, actually even having beers with Arturo and all of that kind of cemented that idea in our heads that we wanted that to be the name of the special interest group. And Renata and I actually probably also, and there were other people involved. Tanvir Ahmed was involved, Nicholas Toreta was also involved. And we all probably had different interests in what we wanted this Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group to do. But my interest was about sharing stories and practices from many universes of design so that people understand, oh, there are actually many ways of doing things, many ways of being and knowing and making. So like I was really interested in things like, what can I learn from Indian design practice, Colombian design practice, Kenyan design practice, etc. And what could I bring back to my teaching in Trinidad? And I mean, I'll say kind of quietly, even though I'm here in the US, I had kind of lost interest in design practice in the US and in Europe. And really just wanted to know what were people doing in places that weren't in the spotlight, and you know what they call design, and you know just where were their overlaps and differences, and how could we learn. It really, I guess, is like what Sousa Santos is talking about, you know, learning from the South with the South. You know, kind of that kind of South-South exchange was what I was really interested in the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group, right? I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, which isn't the worst place to be, but my heart and my mind are always in Trinidad and Brazil, which is complicated. It does mean that there is a little bit maybe of an incongruence sometimes in my work, because I am actually not part of this community that I'm in, you know, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can I do more and more work with communities that I am interested in, right? Let's see, a few other words that I want to drop in about my motivation. So a lot of the projects that I'm interested in the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group are about maybe operationalizing this concept, where it's like, what it is about having conversations across the many universes of design, or the many worlds of design. If we say that the pluriverse is a world where many worlds fit, my role in this pluriverse is that I want to be the telephone operator that's getting the different worlds to talk with each other. And you know, I don't really, my theory background is getting a little bit stronger every day, but my background really is about, you know, let's do this. My thing is about networks and getting people to talk with each other and have conversations. And I guess that's the thing that I'm kind of good at, you know, facilitating conversations. So I'm interested in facilitating conversations across the pluriverse. Maybe I could stop there for a bit, Natalie.
Kia ora, Leslie, and thank you so much. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko hukurangi tuku maunga, ko waipu tuku awa, ko Ngāti Porou tuku iwi, ko Pohautia tuku maunga, ko Taka tuku awa, ko Tikapa tuku marae, ko Te Whānau Pōkai Pohatu tuku hapu, ko Natalie Robertson tuku ingoa. Hukurangi is my mountain, Waipu is my river, Ngāti Porou is my iwi. Pohautia is the sentinel mountain that guards our Waipu river mouth. where the Taka stream flows towards Waiapu and out to Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean. Te whānau pōkai pōhatu is the family, the wider family of all of us who descend from our ancestors, pōkai and pōhatu, centuries ago. And so there are many of us. My family are the Boyds and the Hugheses, and my mother married at Robertson, hence the name, but when I'm identifying myself within my tribal space, I refer to my maternal side. On my father's side, I take the clan name Clan Donakai, which refers to one of the oldest clan systems in the Scottish Highlands, which the Robertsons are one of the oldest families. And so with these very land-based ways of identifying myself, I come into these conversations always from a position of being held by mountains, by rivers, by relationships to whenua, by land, to relationships to the ocean. We're very coastal dwelling people. So my mountains greet your mountains, my rivers greet your rivers. As our oceans divide us, so too do they connect us through the oceanic flows. And Frederick referred to some of those connections that remind us that our ancestors from the Pacific traveled to places such as Rapa Nui, and from there they traveled across to what is now known as South America, but to the coastlines further and further to the east until they met the great land continent. And there the exchange happened with the kumara. And that kumara is central to our way of being and thinking. Many of our ways of thinking about design come about through practices that sustain us. How do we transport this tuba all the way from this great continental homeland across oceans to different island nodes, becoming the kumara vine, the points of connection that shoot out and grow new shoots. And so this kumara is also central to the Waiapu River. It is where the Horota Waka emptied its hull of a great load of kumara. It's where the core or the spade of Penu pierced the earth and helped plant, in fact, released those kumara from our distant homelands of Hawaii across the oceans and brought those kumara to us that we might be sustained. And the tools that came with us, the waka, the canoes that carried them, the tikanga, the protocols, the rules that accompanied that, those are all embedded in our ways of thinking and our ways of being, our ways of designing, our ways of creating, the storytelling, the art, all of these things inform the who we are. And so I want to come now to my place here in this conversation and my role within art and design. So I've been invited to complicate something I think that comes naturally. And so my first complication is that I teach in the School of Art and Design, which has a Maori name, Te Kuratoi a Hoahoa. And before I continue, I invite one of our listeners, Robert Pofari, to perhaps bring some thoughts to this when we come to the questioning, because I'm very interested in how this name comes about and what it actually communicates to us. Because toi is a word that is generally used in Maori for all forms of creative practice. Hoahoa I see as more descriptive of a design, a plan, or a diagram, but I'm not a heritage speaker of Te Reo Māori, and so I rely on the tools such as a range of Māori dictionaries to try to understand this term. For the majority of Māori, they would refer to the practice in art and design, art or design, simply as mahi toi, artwork or the work of art making, showing no distinction between art and design, especially in customary practices. So we see that out in our elaborate carved meeting houses, our wharenui, our wharewhakairo, the carved houses of that have carvings of our ancestors. We don't look and say that part's design, that part's art. We're not distinguishing between the array of practices that create the holistic narratives that come through a carved meeting house, a wharewhakairo. And I come from a transdisciplinary space, and that my first degree was in the social sciences. My master's degree is in fine art and photography, and my PhD in Maori studies. And one thing I'm not is a designer, but I teach in the communication design department, not in the visual arts department, although I do teach at postgraduate across both. This year, just as I was completing my PhD, I was invited by Jocko Muratovsky, a former head of department of our communication design team, to join the Pluriversal working group as part of the Future for Design Education. So I first approached this thinking I'm not really in that space usually, but he felt that I was able to contribute something. And so I took the leap of faith and joined this extraordinary team of thinkers. And I'm so glad that I did, because it's already had great impact on the way that I teach and approach teaching. And so amongst these, particularly amongst this, the conversations we had, Leslie Ann's critical alphabet was something I introduced to my team and my students this year within our teaching. And I also use the diagrams on Leslie Ann's website. And so it's been a really helpful and enriching relationship already. Now, a key provocation for my research comes from the formidable, charismatic Ngāti Porou leader and Rongai Wahine Rakai Pāka, Ko Kikeri Ka. Ko Kikeri passed away in August last year, but mentored me through the early parts of my PhD. Now, many years ago, she was doing her own master's degree, and she announced to me that there is no such thing as mātauranga Maori. Now, I understand mātauranga is knowledge, and so mātauranga Maori is Maori knowledge. So I stood back, I was taken aback, and I sat silently. And after a dramatic pause, and she comes from a family of renowned storytellers and actors, and she said with a flourish of her hand, she said, "There is only mātauranga Rangitukia." And again, I thought, Rangitukia is a very small place on the banks of the Waiapu River. And I thought immediately, what about the knowledge from the other side of the river or from further up the river or other places? But she explained it in more depth. And she talked about knowledge coming from place, knowledge from learning the conditions, materialities, and nature of a place. So this aroused my curiosity on how to consider how my photographic practice could emerge through a conversant relationship with land, river, and ocean. And I draw on a phrase now from Linda Tuhiwai-Smith et al. From 2016, when she talks about knowledge as binding ancient genealogies with contemporary realities. Binding ancient genealogies with contemporary realities, which has exceptional resonance for the relationship between ancestral research and creative practice. And so it's from that place of binding these different ways of thinking, from the realities of my ancestors and where they lived, particularly in the Waiapu River, but also the other places that I have whakapapa to that my ancestors are from. And to think about how that impacts knowledge production. How does that impact anything that I do as a maker and a creator? How does it impact what I do as a thinker? And so how is it that knowledge from place impacts us? And so this, for me, has an interesting resonance with any idea that can be considered universal or pluriversal, because the plural of the uni, the plural verse, and as Frederick has talked about, there are a lot of complications with that. And so that pluriversality, I'm still grappling with how does that sit with Indigenous knowledge of place. And so that's part of the complication and provocation that I'm going to bring today. And I'm fairly fresh to the concept of pluriversality and to Aotearoa Escobar's thinking. But I did jump at the concept when I first saw my friend Professor Huhana Smith pull out a book at a wānanga. We were on my marae at Tikapa, and we were sitting outside, and she pulled out Escobar's book. And so I took a photograph of the cover and thought that's something I'll follow up on. And the appeal is in the acknowledgement that there are worlds, such as in Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, where the distinction between art and design does not exist in the same way as it might in Western knowledge construction or Western education systems. And instead in the concept of mahi toi, this idea of any creative practice. However, as Frederick points out, the co-option of this term is problematic. The hybridity, mestizos, different cultural design. I think there are some really, Frederick has posed some really important provocations, particularly to the idea that what appears to be a radical move can be emptied out of its revolutionary power. And so I'm interested in that as something we pick up again in this conversation, how the co-option of these terms, and I include the co-option of decoloniality here, because I've seen the way the decolonial can be a co-option, and I've seen decolonial conversations in symposia take place without a recognition of the people on whose land those conversations are taking place in. And so this also intersects with the concept of the global south. And for me, this has the potential of flattening, providing an inherent flattening of the colonial and indigenous power differentials. So if we who, under that concept of the global south, are in fact letting ourselves off the hook because we're not participating in we don't see ourselves as participant necessarily in the global north and the capitalist production. When we look closely, of course we are. And so any of these places such as Aotearoa, New Zealand, that have been settled through the colonial project, we inherently have these great conflictual issues. So my complication I want to bring to this, as I usually do, is where are the voices of the Indigenous people in these conversations? Could it be that a term like the pluriverse takes, while it draws on something from Zapatista, also takes away something? And so I want to raise that as a potential question. And now I'm going to turn to some of the conversations that we had through the Pluriversal Working Group. And during that, Alfredo used as a really useful starting point, the where to and where from here. So through cultural connections to places of cultural origin, we, designers, students in design education, can find treasures or taonga from our own knowledge systems to grow seeds of enlightenment or understanding in order to navigate new conditions. And this is how I see how this binding of ancient genealogies with contemporary realities might connect. How might a whakapapa or a genealogical lens offer ways of seeing, listening, designing, making, relating, wayfinding, connecting, sensing, and storytelling? And so I'm not sure about all of you, but when you're choosing your outfits for online presentations, we know we're only going to see the top half, but I thought that I would take this opportunity to show the Honani K. Trask, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Kornai Helu Thaman, and Teresa Aotearoa t-shirt produced by Moana Fresh, as a reminder that the voices of Indigenous women, academics, are often those that are the least heard in these conversations. So I want to ensure that those are the voices that I bring forward into the space. Well, one of the really interesting terms that Alfredo does offers us is around humus, a soil, a fertile soil. And I was thinking about that in relation to the kumara and what the fertility of our mother rivers provide us as a place to grow our knowledge. And my response to that has been to consider the cultural connections to these multiple worldviews that are required in order to position the researcher, and ask open-ended exploratory questions to ask how and where from here. The cultural connections towards the growth of the seed, transplanting and grafting knowledge from their own soils. And I draw in the term pūrākau, storytelling seeds to form a plant, from Jenny Bowley Morgan, who is a Waikato Tainui academic, who points out how language reflects our relationship in the Māori word for nahere, for bush, for nahere, the and here that binds. So we're coming back to this binding. And as Lee Morgan explains, all living things in the bush are connected, while humans depend on the forest for physical and spiritual sustenance. And so she elegantly unpacks the word for stories as te pū or te rākau, pointing out that pūrākau literally refers to the pū, the base or foundation of a rākau or a tree. And this approach that research on ecological and environmental connections to place is a way in which students can be empowered through finding value in ways of knowing and ways of being passed down from multiple cultural connections. So I'm going to turn back to our group now and ask Alfredo. Alfredo, would you like to talk to us a little bit about the humus? And I think you've posed some really interesting questions around the humus and the idea of the fertile soil.
I think Alfredo is not there, but in the meanwhile, while he returns, I would just like to show my t-shirt too, right? So over here, my t-shirt says Centro do Teatro do Oprimido. It's the Theater of the Oppressed Center, which was founded in Rio de Janeiro by Augusto Boal. And he coined this term of complicator to explain what does the person who learns theater oppressed do once he's in a group. And he called that person the joker. It's a role, but it's a role for everybody who joins theater oppressed to develop. So it's not like the director role, which is so important for theater. It's the idea basically that everybody becomes the director of their own lives by joining such kind of a theater. But to understand the possibilities in your life, you also need to get conscious of the difficulties, the conditions that does not allow you to do whatever you want. There's those, if you look carefully, usually comes because you are a kind of a person in a social group that has a history. That's what he called oppression. And then theory of the oppressed is the means to understand and complicate your own condition, seeing yourself both as oppressor in one relation and as oppressed in another relation. That's something which is difficult sometimes to grasp in these discussions, because people, they tend to pick just one relation at once. So let's look at global South relations, and let's leave behind, for example, gender relations. And then you end up by having, again, men leading the conversation and not really listening to women. And while they are talking about overcoming oppression, that's why Augusto Boal said, we cannot fight oppression alone, and one oppression at a time, because then unwillingly or sometimes knowingly, another oppression will come and will take over. and then you will end up becoming an oppressor while you want to be liberated from oppression relations. Therefore, for Augusto Boal and Paulo Freire, Álvaro Vieira Pinto, and other Latin American authors who have touched upon this topic, they believe it's only possible to fight all oppression systems at once. And so what's the role of design in these discussions? Is design oppression itself? Does design oppress? A designer is an oppressor. A designer is an oppressed person. It depends on the kind of relation we are talking. As I already mentioned, there's the colonial relation, there is the gender relation, there is the class relation. But following up on the work of Álvaro Vieira Pinto, who was the master of Paulo Freire, now developing this concept of coloniality of making to specify the kind of relation that design is pretty much enmeshed, which is somehow related to what Natalie was talking about, of these hierarchies between what is making, what is design, what is art, and what is design. And especially, I'm also interested not just on the universalized ontologies or the academic discourse on is this design or art, but really on the geopolitical dimension of who does the design, who does the making, because this has profound impact on the environment and the global politics. Right now, where are the strongest powers in the world? Well, in the places where people fabricate, where they make such stuff, and the places where people design the stuff. And this shouldn't be downplayed. It's really strong conflict. It will have much more different consequences on our lives, but we have to make sure that we are aware that we are taking part in this conflict and raising the grounds if we keep repeating these traditional definitions, what design is or the art is, without critically reflecting on the consequences of those definitions. And definitions can also be made and stated to the world by just applying the definition, just by making something or designing something or being a designer. You already make a statement to the world. You already change how people perceive who is a designer, who can be a designer. I mean, can a Maori person be a designer? I'm wondering about it. But the best way to answer that question is a Maori person telling, I am a designer too, but I'm not a designer. And that relationship between our positionalities and the objects of our work is very important to scrutinize also from the perspective of oppression. And it's not just about the relationship between traditional groups that has been historically oppressed, as I mentioned, because there are a lot of layers of materialities that are sometimes not taken into account. And I believe this concept of coloniality and making might help us to grasp. Although the pluriverse is interesting concept as well, because we can articulate those different relations under a more conflictual framework. I believe that the concept of fitting is not even a good translation of the original saying in the Zapatista movement. It's not a mundo que se quepa vários mundos. It cannot be really well translated by a word that fits many words, because fitting is already exclusionary word, because sometimes you fit, sometimes you don't fit. And it's one of the worst, I would say, excuses for not hiring a person in an organization, a person who is of color, of indigenous origins, has a different mindset. No, you don't fit in this organization. You don't fit in this world. And fitting is definitely not a good justification, because if a person is supposed to enter that world or to enter that organization, that person is supposed to change that organization. If there's no space for that person to change that world, to change that organization, if it just can't fit within the world that already exists, it's doomed. The revolution won't happen of the Zapatistas. Therefore, I believe we must definitely scrutinize those concepts critically, but not just throwing them out. It's all about using for the interesting purpose. So we can always use colonial legacy or other kinds of legacies from other kinds of systems of oppression against oppressors. So I believe we can use the tools of the oppressors against the oppressor. However, we need critical consciousness, conscientization, as Leslie and remember here in the chat box.
Yeah.
So who wants to?
I'll jump in, but I have so many things to say, right? So, and I'll probably forget some of them, right? But you know, it's interesting that you said a world where many worlds fit, and I don't ever use that word fit when I describe the pluriverse. I just say a world of many worlds. You know, I'm not trying to see, well, okay, do they actually fit into the space? Because I see the space as a little bit more elastic than that. You know, the worlds will just be there, right? And maybe the pluriverse will expand and contract according to how many worlds are there, right? But what was one other thing that I had wanted to say? You know, like, I think with regard to the conscientização, you know, like that critical awareness is really important for us to also see. It's not as simple as, okay, like you said, we are oppressed or we are oppressors, because we actually often play both roles, you know. And I think that there is the complication or the potential complication of the pluriverse that also has, you know, where each world has all of these many layers, I think is important to bring into the discussion sometimes, you know. And, you know, like people will have a conversation with me and say, oh, well, you're probably anti-capitalist or something like that. And actually, no, I'm, you know, I have to be aware of my own connections to neo-colonialism and capitalism and all that. But maybe maybe 10 years ago, I would not have the critical awareness to be a little bit more to understand then my personal role in all of this, you know. And so like that is something that we can seek to bring into the design conversations a little bit more, so that we are understanding that when we occupy different roles, if we reflect on these roles more, we can decide where we are moving within the space, but we might not be as innocent as we might want to think that we are. Let me see, what else was the other note? With regard to the co-opting of the word pluriverse, I do think that is an issue, a problem. And then maybe with my link to capitalism and all that, I kind of think, well, sometimes you ride a trend because people will actually pay attention. That's how I feel about DEI work, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or, you know, everybody, like I walked in a neighborhood the other day and every single house had a Black Lives Matter sign. I thought, how many Black people do these people actually know, right? But sometimes you kind of ride a wave because they're actually paying attention now. Okay, well, let's push the conversation a little bit further because they're interested now. So I feel that the interest in Escobar's book gives us that little, gives us some space to have some conversations that maybe we couldn't have 10 years ago, you know. And if I talked about, so the term that Renata and I used to use in our work in the DRS was about multiple voices or multiple perspectives. We had a different term that we were using and nobody was interested in that, you know. But if we do the work now, you know, today when we do the work, because everyone is already interested in designs from the pluriverse, yes, we can have the same conversations that we have wanted to have for 5 years, but now people are paying a little bit more attention to it. And so, yes, I would ride that wave and continue taking the conversation in different directions while the eyeballs are on it. Could be a little neoliberal, I suppose, but.
So I'm going to put my trickster hat on there and say, is it a sexy term?
It definitely is. And I hate to say it, yes, it is. And I am opportunistic, you know, and I say, well, okay, if they will have the conversations now, let's have them very loudly. And then there's some ridiculous conversations that we also have to shut down, you know, which are part of this conversation and interest in this sexy term. Like there was a question the other day. I hope it wasn't from anyone in this room, right? But there was a question on Twitter the other day. Okay, how do we do this pluriversal design? What are the steps? You know, I was so shocked at that, that someone, if we're talking about many worlds, why are we looking for this guidebook, and I guess that's the way we do things in design. People are always looking for guidebooks and method cards, right? And stuff like that. And and so, we can be very loud about saying, well, actually, no, that's not the right question. The better question is this, look. So from the chat, we had, I think, Ricardo talking about conscientização, and Diana saying, talking about acompañamiento. So, we can shift the conversation to the things that we think are more important while people are still interested in these conversations.
So Leslie, and it sounds like that was a color by numbers question, the step-by-step one.
Oh boy, I don't know.
Quite cynically, yeah. So I'd just like to bring it back to Alfredo. Alfredo, you dropped out towards the end of my conversation that I was having that led from your "and we're from here." And in your pluriversal presentation, you talked about the humus, and you also gave us this bringing together humus and soil and a living land of cultivation, Andean chakra, where everything being and becoming breeds and is raised by others. Would you like to add to that, Alfredo, and just bring us to that part of the fertile soil that will be just to have some more seeds to plant?
Yeah. When we say the power of modern colonial matrix imposes Eurocentric classificatory violence through bibliographies and methods, however often they are proclaimed, guidelines, steps, stages, strategies, techniques, and all self-absorbed modalities reduce the heterogeneity. Yes, I don't know what happened, but suddenly the power of the digital totalitarianism expelled me when I start to talk. There are something in the universal forces that is not interesting that I finish my intervention. But I was trying to say that the problem, not just with pluriverse and even the colonial and even global, I like the word south with every possible adjective, less global, because global dissolves all difference, and make us believe that a neighborhood in Bogotá is similar to a neighborhood in Johannesburg or in Wellington and it's not. For me, the colonial maneuver, rather than destabilizing the researcher relationship, or assuming that the noun design can engulf countless adjectives often mean abandoning research and design ideas altogether when approaching human groups for whom those ideas are strange, and learn or try to learn what's there instead of those, not to assume the other as a variant of myself or my classificatory ways, but rather try to assume myself and my words and structures as variants of those of the other. When I was listening, Frederick, I was asking myself, what if the very, very idea of design is kind of oppressive? For me, it is when the designer thinks that he or she can capture the future of everyone. Is for that reason I like the relation between design and archaeology, because modern archaeology tries to capture the past of all human groups, and mainstream design, and the problem is that sometimes it can also happen with pluriverse. What pluriversalistic designers, is such word could be exist, things that the word they use let them understand everything. For me, it's very, very important, this approach to ignorance. Know what as what you respect that you can catch altogether. The very idea of project for me is kind of problematic, because projects impose its shadows over the meanings of practice and materialities of the others. You know, perhaps I am being silly, but for me, it's not necessarily going hyper-local, as Frederick pointed me in a conversation, but for me, it's important in some moments, try, not always, but try to imagine by the side of design, other practices that no are based on projects, no try to live in the idea that they can model the future, than open to mystery, open to the what is not the immensity, heterogeneity, the incommensurability and translatability of wisdoms and practices in which those outside of the academic disciplinary field live and bring into existing their works, providing elements to respectfully approach otherness in his difference and divergences, languages, locations, cultures, spiritualities. But even these words, class, ethnicity, gender, species, etc., are imposed by the dominant world. For me, the better example as to date is the Argentinian anthropologists that work with Arturo Escobar, Mario Blaser, one who explained this relation with the over the animal that Western people in Canada name, taking the word of the Mi'kmaq people, caribou, or reindeer. For the Innu people and First Nation people from Labrador and Terra Nova, what European call reindeer or Atico, or reindeer or caribou, these people name Atico, Atico. And Europeans say Atico is the word that Innu people uses for reindeer or caribou. But there is a tricky movement that one lost in the way, because in spite of whatever can be the animal that we call caribou, it's a construction of geography, linguistic, ecology, biology, history, and a lot of Western wisdoms that construct that animal as phylum, species, subspecies, And when you say Atico is, as Innu people call the reindeer, you assume that Innu people uses all the Western science to build their animal, But even the idea of animal is strange to the Innu people. My question is every that we in the academy is product of several disciplines or wisdoms or Western wisdom as tools. The others wisdoms, artifacts are a result of what? If caribou or reindeer is geography más biology más linguistic, Atiku is legend plus oral tradition plus tradition, ecological knowledge. And for me, for that reason, I try to hear very respectfully when Robert or Natalie or even Marcus uses Tereo Maori, because even if I can understand the language, paying attention to the musicality links me with what I cannot learn, links me what the lingua franca erased. For instance, my soul is in Spanish. I am violent myself trying to explain in English. And si yo paso a hablar español, probablemente muchos de ustedes no entiendan nada de lo que yo estoy diciendo. Pero that the fact that you don't understand the Spanish don't imply that what I am telling is nor stupid, nor clever. The only thing that you can know is that you don't talk Spanish. If you can find if what I'm telling is important or not, you must learn Spanish. Then when I approach to Tereo Maori or to Lakota or to any language, I must live in the border between language, in the possibility of the emergence of my own ignorance, and in the acknowledging that I never can learn Maori ways totally, but I respectfully can honor my ignorance of it. And just to end this long intervention, sorry, for me, the same artifact, or what we call artifact, can be a result of several processes of creation. Just one of them being design or Western design. The others could be you call craft or whatever. But if you pay attention to that, the same things, ironically, could be several things at the same very moment. You know, that's my point. And for that, when I propose an acronym for this practice that I cannot reduce to designs, I try to give the opportunity to the other to speak in other terms. I don't try to replace the word design for another word to catch all the meanings of other people, but propose a generalization that is a tricky one, but because that is not. It's just a strategic word that we meet the local real words, left the building to let them speak. I hope to make sense in my poor English. But another thing that I wish to add is that this ceremony is very emotional. In sometimes when Natalie, when Leslie, when Frederick, even when Marcus were talking, I lost the ideas of the words because I am paying attention to the gestures of the bodies, you know, and analyzing the bodies. My attention migrate from our conversation with words to our conversation with gestures, and these several layers of communication are very important for me, and my political activism is against any kind of generalization that makes you believe that you understand that you don't.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Alfredo. And after our email conversations, I was thinking about and reading your starting points around humus, and I was thinking that perhaps where you were coming from was the humus verse or the humosphere. So I was proposing that just as you proposed the term, and I find it difficult to pronounce it, but design ignorance, or can you say it for us again, your term?
In Spanish will be diseñorancia. In English, designorance, you just mix the word design and ignorance.
Right.
Disignorance.
Ignorance. Okay, so yeah, I've mixed the universe and pluriverse to come up with the humusverse. So that's thinking of where you're coming from. And so I want to come to a question for Frederick. And Frederick, listening to your conversation about the oppressed, I wondered, and then ideas of repression, I wondered about the place of what Shayla Sandoval would call, in methodologies of the oppressed, what Shayla Sandoval refers to as love as a movida for change, is what are the conditions that bring us to speak from our desire to change, or desire to revolve, to bring about revolution, and desire to change where we are, change where things are at, and all of us are involved as change makers in some way or another. As you said, as soon as we're invited into a place, we ought to be able to be making some change, or else what is the point of us being there? We're just replicating the status quo. So I wonder if you might speak, I've managed to bring sex and love into it, which is great, and some concepts of fertility. So I hope that I'm playing my complicator role well here. And so if we can maybe shift into aroha and love, where do these desires for change come from? And how do you see that as fitting with these ideas where you're speaking to around oppression and design?
Paulo Freire said that loving a person is really wanting that person to become free as part of the group that the person is has grown inside and has a history with. So fighting oppression, it was the best act of love, at least from his perspective of a pedagogue, an educator working in Brazil and also in other countries from the South. And I think that he says that love is also the other side of anger, because you are angry because things are not just, but then you do something to change the situation, to restructure the situation so that the people that does not get the most benefit, they can also have a chance to fight. And while we are working from that side, for example, if I personally, in Brazil, mostly I'm working on the oppressor side because I'm identified as a white person who's has European ancestors. But in international, especially global North organized events, I'm usually on the side of the oppressed. I don't have the good command of English language. I don't know all the global North cultural references. And sometimes I feel dumb, like Alfredo was telling like a few minutes ago. It's difficult to convey my ideas in English. However, it's an opportunity that I take because I usually, like most oppressed people, wouldn't lose the opportunity to challenge the oppressors in a global perspective or any other perspective, any other relation that we're working on. And for example, this concept that Alfredo is developing on how do we relate to different cultures, different people, to different cosmovisions, or different things that we don't know what they are, because we don't even have a proper conception that can bridge the gaps. It is the perspective of the oppressors. So how do I, as an oppressor, becomes aware that the way I'm framing people is detrimental to them. The way I approach them, it's not respectful enough. I'm just putting people in the drawers that I have in my desk. I'm not really listening to them, what they have to speak. And I'm not even recognizing that they might already have design or something else that I don't know what it is, but that plays a similar function. So he used this concept of equi-alter-valent. It's not equivalent, it's equi-alter-valent. It's different, but it plays a similar role. However, I already asked Alfredo, and I would just prompt the question to him back again. So what do you have to offer to the oppressed side? So the oppressed is looking from the other side. So the person is already been a victim of this misplacing, misframing of the view of the cosmovision, usually reductive. But what can they do? And I have an idea based on your concept, and responding also the complication of Natalie. What do the oppressed want? They want to not just be equal. So equality is not something that the oppressed are aiming for, because equality means all those centuries of exploitation are just forgotten. That's not fair. Oppressed want reparation. The oppressed want power. They want to feel like they are sometimes more than the oppressors are, because they feel like the oppressors have damaged not them alone, but their ancestors, and they have created this unequal world. So I would suggest, Alfredo, that we have to find equi-alter potentes, equi-alter potents. So what will be the equivalent in our culture of the oppressed that could be used to better fight the oppressors, or to do something in a different way that we don't even need to fight because we are so much better that we don't need to recourse to violence to do the same that you are doing. For example, we don't necessarily need to buy new products all the time. We can fix them. For example, here in Brazil, we have an equipotent concept, which is gambiarra. Brazilians, I hope you love it. and some Brazilians, they would look at this and feel ashamed, especially if they have a more colonial mindset. They would say, that's the wrong way of doing things. But I would say this has power, because if we work out and do something with less than ideal conditions for doing, that's basically the essence of a gambiarra is, I guess we are trying to show that we have creative potential to overcome situations, and we are confident that we work, even if we won't wait for the best conditions to come. And I guess there are plenty others equipotent concepts and practices that we can find. But then if we go into that direction, we must make sure that we are on the side of the oppressed. And that won't happen just by identification. According to Augusto Boal, Paulo Freire, and others, they say sometimes you are not born on the oppressed side, but you feel like as an oppressor, there's something missing in you, or there's something you don't like. You don't like to play the oppressor role. So you turn sides, and then you become an ally of the oppressed. And that's, I believe, one of the possible positionalities of a designer to join the oppressed group. Then it has to be very respectful, has to listen first and foremost, and has to support what's already going on, and not just come with a nice project, as Alfredo said. What are the projects that people already have? What are the equipotent concepts that are not even projects, and that might be even more powerful for the liberation of these people?
Kia ora, thank you, Frederick. I'm actually going to throw this over to Leslie, because we could go back to Alfredo and hear that perspective, but I'm really actually interested in an island perspective. So we're here on an island. Leslie, you introduced yourself beginning to come from an island, and it's very different to continental thinking. And I just wondered if you might reflect on the conversation from both Alfredo and Frederick there, from an island perspective, because I'm sure you've got a different view that comes from there.
Wow, that's a hard question, Natalie. I'm from a complicated island, right? Because it's an island where we are like super consumers, and so on one hand, yes, we have island mentality, but because we're in the Caribbean, because we're too close maybe to the United States, we are kind of receiving kind of I guess, I don't know if to call it capitalism by extension, or right. How would I bring an island perspective to this conversation? What I was thinking when everyone was talking is I was thinking about the role of the designer's amplifier, and then the role of, networks, right, and conversations, and so I'm gonna answer your question with a question, because this was a question that I was thinking of. So in some of the work that we're doing in the special interest group, we don't have any bigger agenda than just to make sure that other people are talking about what they're doing, right? When I say other people, not the usual voices, and there are actually two groups in the DRS that have this kind of agenda, where it's just about making sure that enough perspectives are heard and shared, and people don't have to form any kind of opinion. So I wanted to bring that kind of question to this group. What is the validity then, from your point of view, of this kind of work? Is it that we have to have a more political agenda, or is it just good enough for these two groups, the education group and the pluriversal group. You know, this is our agenda, where it's just about kind of like, we're tired of only hearing from these perspectives. Let's make sure and open up voices for other people. So I'm throwing the question back to any of the three of you. Is this enough? Or I don't have to ask if it's enough, but kind of like, what's, from your perspective, what's the validity of that? I don't know. I'm afraid to ask that here.
Well, I was thinking about how design is inherently political, and that it reflects the cultural political frameworks from which we come from. And yet it's operated certainly in the education systems and structures that I've been a part of, as something that is somehow acultural and apolitical, and it's been able to operate under that guise, I believe, for a really long time, without us necessarily challenging the positioning of the researcher or the positioning of the designer or the maker. So I think we're in a time of flux and change in answer to that. But I'm just going to pause for a moment. Marcos, it is 10 to 12. Did you anticipate throwing this open to our audience at all? Because I think Leslie Ann's question could spark another half hour of conversation. I'm just cognizant of time here. Could you just guide us, please?
Yes, we had a plan initially to close at 12, but I also don't want to, it's so rich. I think it's so interesting. I think if you think it's a good idea, if you could wrap up the whole thing in your next, whatever time you need, Natalie, and then we go for a close, because there's a kind of agenda with the AV guys. They are listeners on the background just to make sure everything is all right. So if that's all right, I will go for that.
Well, I actually wanted to invite a guest speaker to the panel for a moment, if I could invite Robert.
Oh, please. So just let you know, guest, actually Robert is never a guest because he's since the beginning. So Robert is also part of me. Come on in, Rob.
Absolutely. Kia ora e te rangatira. Robert, I wondered if you might pick up on the idea of mahi toi or toi, and even this idea of hoho, which I don't see that as sitting in necessarily the same kind of way that toi is understood culturally, but perhaps you can unpack for us perhaps this idea of less separation between art and design from a Māori perspective, more something that's a little more integrated and coming from your perspective. And I recognise that your perspective comes from tūhoe, and acknowledge that will not be considered representative of all Māori, but simply like from your own tribal perspective. Kia ora.
Kia ora, panel. That was fascinating and really interesting. I don't know whether I could stick to the topic, Natalie, because like you, I'm also a disruptor. And sometimes I might touch on the subject and I may not, but I just want to pick up on some of the things that we were talking about. Earlier, Marcos asked me to translate some of the titles and possibly the abstracts for this conference, which I found enormously difficult because, we were talking about language like paradoxical saints, for instance. I had to work out what a saint was to begin with, given that we have no saints in tūhoe, because we sometimes don't have this concept of aroha, which is love. We have a concept called utu, which means revenge. When your lands and your culture has been taken away from you and you are oppressed, you don't have much love in your heart for the oppressor. You have utu, which is revenge. And in that quest for revenge, you seek to, as Paulo Freire says, to rename the world about you. And I'm not going to talk about rehumanizing those who oppressed us, but it's another world for me, for tūhoe, okay? So I just want everybody to understand why it was so difficult to translate these incredibly difficult concepts in design, art and design. When you had words like augmented reality, algorithms, telematics, which I don't understand, virtual reality, I had to seek very deeply the understanding of those words in English. I didn't understand them in English, let alone in our own language, and translate. We have, in our language, we have only 13 letters in the alphabet. And every word in our language ends in a vowel. It is very, very complicated to, to translate things like atypical reality. I mean, it's just incredibly difficult. So when you ask me about the notion of Natalie around design and huahua, yeah, there are many different words for design, like hanga. Hanga is to build. Waihanga is to create. Tauira are models, and huahua is also to plan, to lay out plans, to construct. There are those sorts of words. But I just want to leave that here for the moment. I just want to just talk about the last provocation that you raised, Natalie, with Leslie, about this idea of islands, of having a particular perspective from peoples who live on a collective of islands. And I just want to throw into this notion, for us, I'm really keen on this notion of collective memory, collective consciousness, and collective intelligence. And I'm talking about us living in islands, having voyaged here over thousands, 10,000 years of voyages across the Pacific, trajectories across the Pacific. And over that time, we built up a vast body of knowledge around science, about voyaging, around technology, around astrology, reading the stars. And in our epistemology, in our worldview, our whakapapa, our genealogies begin with the cosmological narratives, the narratives of gods. The next set of and in that set of knowledges, talk around the cosmology, the gods were held in a close embrace by the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, and in what I call the celestial incubator, in which the gods were kept within this darkness, and there was this struggle and fight amongst them to split Sky Father and Earth Mother apart to bring light into the world. And so that's a whole set of knowledge, and all of that knowledge has whakapapa, has genealogy, has layers of meaning, and it is brought down, and it explains, it's our ancestors' way of explaining what happened in the heavens. That knowledge is also refined over the voyages of our canoes across the Pacific over the last 5,000 years, and they built up another set of history, knowledge, and collective memories. And so I see us as, from these islands, having created a unique set of knowledges that that have been passed down through millennia. And so I just want to just put that on the table for us to talk about. Yes, I think art and design, it is not my area of speciality, but I have since come to understand in my own work for the development of my PhD, which was to study some of that cosmological information and knowledge that is locked in those narratives, is that our ancestors talked about the notion of multiverses rather than universes, and that our gods were able to travel interdimensionally. In fact, the precedents upon which our whole Maori society, not just Tuhe, but all of the other tribes are predicated on, the actions and the precedents created in these narratives. First human for Maori that was created is actually a woman, not a man. We were not born like Adam and Eve, but for Maori, first human was created was a woman formed from the earth, humus you were talking about, from earth. Her name was Hine Ahuone, the maiden created from earth. And she becomes the first human. But it doesn't end there. She has a daughter to the god, and then the god, they have a daughter, Hine Titama. The god also procreates with her. And when she realizes that her father was in fact her lover was her father, she flees to the underworld to become Hine Nui Te Po, the goddess of death. But the story is not about death per se. It's about the fact that it created a myth message for us, for Maori, about how we behave. That story was to tell Maori society that incest is forbidden. So in our culture, incest is not acceptable. It is prohibited, and it is totally taboo, tapu. It is not permitted. So these stories weren't just grand narratives or epic narratives. They were teaching tools for the way that we predicate our society and how we behave towards each other and also towards the environment. That's what I wanted to say. Sorry, it's got nothing to do with art and design, but it's got to do with the values and the ideas, design ideas perhaps, that our ancestors left within these whakapapa and our narratives and the place that we come from, presumably at the wrong end of the anatomy of the world, but hopefully it's far enough away from Donald Trump.
Kia ora. Beautiful way to finish thinking about multiverses. I was thinking of the 12 heavens. I was thinking also of the other disruptions to the relationships as they're explained to us through a mum and a dad, because there's also Wainui Aotea, our ocean mother, and her relationship with Ranginui. So they have more than one coupling. We have that those couplings were not just limited to a single heteronormative structure. So that's always opens up a whole other way of oceanic thinking around the moana, the sea that flows between islands. And so islands, of course, are just these nodes, but between them is our fluid continent. And so I'm just going to, aware that we've now, the clock has struck midday, and I will just pass it back to each of our panelists just to wrap up and say some final words and leave it with you all. And thank you so much, Robert, for bringing that richness from this place, from this whenua, to share with everyone here and to speak around the issue of translation, which is also at the heart of this conversation. Kia ora koutou katoa. I will pass it to perhaps Leslie Ann, Frederick, Alfredo, whoever wants to go first to.
I'm not going to be that profound, so I'll just start. I think, so you just spoke about translation, and that is a question that I always have in my mind. You know, are these words and terms really exclusive? And what are the big ideas that we want people to get? You know, when we talk about the pluriverse or pluriversal design, or, you know, whatever term we're using at the moment, what is the big idea that we really want people to take away? And how can we strip away some of the jargon so that people can just understand plain language. I'm not even going to say plain English, or so that we can really have these communication, have this communication. Like I'm not a theorist, so like when we start these conversations, I am sometimes swimming. So I think, okay, and I have a PhD. What about the person who, doesn't, how are we just going to have these conversations in ways that are a little bit less exclusive? And I think that the language is a barrier, right? And I think it's something for us to think about as we move forward. And I'll pass it to Fred, who I can see.
Well, there's not just verbal language, there's also body language. There's also thousands of different languages that we engage with in the design work. And I guess there are some languages that we don't know because we also not part of cultures that only have that language and they haven't reached us. So by joining a culture, by joining a new language, you also get to learn about the new culture. And that's one way of somehow working out those differences. If you learn a language, you do not become exactly like the other person. So you do not copy what the other person is doing, because you can only learn a language if you put yourself into that language. I would never learn English if I didn't have Frederick's English. I have to put myself into the language and learn from the way I reconstruct the language. And I guess that's an interesting way of approaching this intercultural dialogue. So what do I have in me that will change while I'm going through this dialogue, but that will still remain as me, even with my prejudice, even with the things that are not so nice and I'm not so proud of, they won't go away. I won't be like cleaned from oppression. I won't be cured from oppression. Even if I join a Pluriversal design. So what are the steps, the easy steps? They aren't known, but we have to, the first one surely is putting ourselves at stake and our positionalities and being fragile enough to listen to something that we won't like. So we have to agree that we will disagree as we disagree in this conversation, but still, we learned something, we changed a little bit, and we will go back to our lives and do other things, and so many different places, but we still can believe that we can coexist in such a difference. If we agree, that we would disagree, if you agree that we will have conflicts, that's fine. We can work them out. However, if we go the other way, trying to erase conflicts and become equal, as I said at the beginning, then the pluriverse will be just a melting pot and it's over. Game is over for the oppressed.
I asked to the spirit of the land when I leave, perhaps to try to communicate the special that has been the occasion for me, not just to talk with my friends in Aotearoa, Marcos and Tatiana and Diana, but to encounter again the presence of my past with you, but the joy that brings to my spirit come to talk, but hear a lot more. It was an honor to hear you, Robert. I always learn a lot of you. Our brief meeting plant seeds in my soul that you can even imagine, but I remember very well. And Natalie, you were giant today. The soul of the meeting. It was amazing as you guide the conversation. Thank you. And Marcus, thank you for letting me the opportunity of bring with me my wonderful colleagues. I admire a lot to Leslie and Frederick. Then thank you to the people to honor us with giving their words in the chat, because you know words are collective creation. Every word that comes out of mouth is the creation of generation of people, many people. Then this is not the end, just nor the beginning too, just a moment in the magic of life. But I like this idea of Natalie build over my provocation of grafting, with the seed grafting, kind of hybridization in our own ideas on the move. And it's interesting to be part of this conversation. No conclusion, no answer, but for me it was a very, very, very happy moment. I enjoy a lot this conversation. Thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you all so much. It's just been an absolute pleasure meeting all of you this year and working with you in the working group has just enriched my thinking and my approach to teaching and reconsiderations of how these terms are adopted and co-opted, and then also how do we take them on and how do we have them, how do we take this to our students as well? And that's something that's always on my mind. Kia ora, thank you so much, Marcos, and everyone on Link for the invitation. I'm going to hand it back to you. It's just been a pleasure to join you and participate in this small way in this in the set of linkages and the ways that you've brought us all together so beautifully. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou.